carry me back to old Virginia. Carry me back to old Virginia. There's where the cotton and the corn and taters grow.
Choppy waves, giant swells, and churning Atlantic waters awaited William Berkeley's October journey to Virginia. The Atlantic could be deadly. But in some ways, the ocean was a safer choice than living in either England or Virginia during the mid-17th century. Berkeley understood the serious risks of all three choices, but still chose to attempt the dangerous ocean crossing and make his way to Virginia. Virginia's last couple of decades had been quite turbulent, but Berkeley didn't have to be in Virginia to get a taste of her volatility. Would he be able to find calm amidst the coming chaos? Berkeley's intricately designed plan to succeed Francis Wyatt as Virginia's next governor fell into place quite nicely, at first. But as time went on, and news of Wyatt's replacement reached the colony, some leading figures used their clout to create further roadblocks for Berkeley. The incoming governor began organizing 36 servants, while shelling out £1,000 on clothing for those in his retinue. He also stocked a personal library, tools, food, furniture, and other items deemed necessary for his new Virginia life. Berkeley then endured a long search to find a ship captain daring enough to make the dangerous journey during the worst months, the early fall, to cross the Atlantic. After tedious, long weeks of preparation, the day finally came to leave London on October 25, 1641. Berkeley could never have seen or known that he had one final obstacle to navigate. Political fallout from Governor Harvey's rocky tenure had enough time to reach English ears before Berkeley finalized his trip, and the House of Lords demanded the would-be governor answer the charges made against him. Berkeley had no knowledge about Anthony Panton and Richard Kemp's hatred for one another. He didn't even know who Anthony Panton was. It also seems doubtful that Berkeley knew too much about Richard Kemp, but that would soon change, as Kemp was the colony's secretary. So, while Berkeley's plans were being made, Anthony Panton worked to link Kemp and Berkeley together in an underhanded plot that cast doubt on Berkeley's appointment. Panton sent word across the Atlantic, which reached the right targets. Thus, Berkeley became embroiled in Virginia's tempestuous politics before he left English shores, even before he knew who the principal antagonists might be. Frustrated, Berkeley rose to the final challenge in his own way. He petitioned the House of Lords, reminding them of their position in hindering his livelihood, which then forced him to turn to the Crown for help. Charles gave him the honor of governing Virginia. That being the case, he set his plans in motion, and waiting any longer would completely ruin him. He had to go to Virginia now. Then he drove his main point home by denying any wrongdoing with Richard Kemp. Further, he didn't know who this Anthony Panton was. But Panton's claim wasn't to charge that Berkeley had committed any crime. So why was Berkeley being detained? If there were more to be said by this Panton, fine. Berkeley would answer any charge. Otherwise, please let the journey commence. After a few days of deliberation, the House of Lords stood out of Berkeley's way, and he was off to Virginia in early November.
Where there is a fire in my belly and peace in my mind that keeps trying to tell me strength in the spine. Oh, through this life, there comes a time to move a mountain side.
The holdup forced the trek to take a longer route, the one that the original Jamestown settlers endured in 1607, instead of the shorter voyage that Samuel Argall championed a few years later. That being the case, Berkeley's trip was relatively pleasant by way of the Canaries and Caribbean before he set eyes on Virginia for the first time in late February 1642. If Berkeley recorded his first impressions upon arrival, they're now lost. He would have just finished surviving a 4-month, cramped, inhospitable ocean crossing, only to arrive at a struggling colony with an ambiguous future. To top it all off, the weather, as is normally the case during late winter, was cold and wet. So it was like Berkeley was still in England, in that respect at least, but in all others, he was in a new, foreign world. A world that boasted vast, open stretches of forested land peopled by a few of his struggling countrymen and hostile natives. It was Virginia, but it wasn't home just yet. Before Berkeley could attempt to make a home for himself, he had to go through official state business. Francis Wyatt and the General Assembly were present at Jamestown, working on new legislation regarding local governments when Berkeley's ship arrived. Upon receiving word, Wyatt suspended the assembly until April, while he formally transferred power to Sir William. Berkeley was now legally official and physically present. He could now acquaint himself with his colony, or his colony could acquaint itself with her new governor, to look at it another way. William would have to endure the seasoning just like any other Virginia newcomer. He had to adjust over time to her damp, winter cold, as well as to her moist, summer heat. Most who endured seasoning before the 1640s fell short and died. Berkeley, however, could count himself one of the lucky survivors by the next year. During his seasoning period, Berkeley took to managing his 3,000-acre land grant known as the Governor's Land. It was here that he recouped some of his financial losses by exacting rent from those living on and tending his land. But Berkeley was never one to sit idly by. He also jumped into the farming role almost immediately and remained quite involved until his volatile departure more than 30 years later. For Governor Berkeley, seasoning meant more than adjusting to Virginia's rough climate and land. It meant that he would also have to quickly plug into Virginia's harsh political landscape as well. Yet, starting this task without close friends or trusted advisors made his job all the more difficult. Many of Virginia's elite were leery of their new governor. Would he be another Harvey? Was he to curtail their newly found liberties? Who was this Sir William Berkeley, member of King Charles's court anyway? After all, Berkeley wasn't really one of them in any sense. The hated Harvey could at least boast a resume that included some work in the colony during some of its most morbid times. Berkeley was completely different. He was a gentleman of the highest caliber, close to the king. Mostly, however, immediate opinion was low because Berkeley replaced Francis Wyatt, a man that was widely respected by so many. Knowing that the king was involved did Berkeley no favors either. The royal connection soon proved precarious over the next few years as the English Civil War unfolded, so he couldn't truly rely upon friends in high places when the going got tough. And Berkeley certainly had difficult tests ahead. He was a newcomer, man in the middle trying to reinvent himself in a hostile, foreign land.
Great unknown was meant to be found. And whoa, it's calling me now. Open the doors. I've been here once before, but wasn't really sure what I was.
No matter what one thinks about Berkeley's later years, his first tenure, against all odds, was spectacular. Governor Harvey did lay a bit of a foundation down with some of his land reform ideas. He is also responsible for some of the updates done to a dilapidated Jamestown. Such work saw more structures, such as a brick church, built in the colonial capital. Harvey also planned a state house, but though he forced the tax to erect the building, Harvey would never see it built. His successor, Francis Wyatt, however, did, sort of, in that they converted Harvey's house into the place of official state business after Harvey left. Speaking of Wyatt, he added to Harvey's foundation by having Jamestown declared Virginia's chief town by Act of Assembly. Whatever chief town meant seemed to have an effect on those jockeying for powerful positions within the colony. Men like Richard Kemp were leaving the rotten swamp for healthier places like the Middle Plantation, or today's Williamsburg. But Wyatt wanted them to stay close by, not unlike their more famous French contemporary Louis XIV had desired when he built Versailles 4 decades later. Other than the few newer buildings mixed in with older, shabbier structures at Jamestown, Berkeley also saw haggard workers mingling with various farmers, planters, and tradesmen, selling what they had to merchants like John Chew and George Menifee. He quickly realized that someone of his stature was missing at the capital. At least that's what he said to Dutch Captain David Pieters de Vries shortly after the governor arrived at Jamestown. Berkeley thought in a grander manner than anything Harvey or Wyatt envisioned. And King Charles supported those visions in that he wanted Berkeley to keep building on Harvey's earlier foundations. Yet, Berkeley wasn't limited to building in only Jamestown. He was to encourage anyone who owned more than 500 acres to assist in building a 24-by-16 brick house with a basement at Jamestown. Further, wherever Berkeley built this new house, he could name it the New Chief Town at Jamestown. In addition, Berkeley encouraged prominent Virginians further afield to build new towns in their newly settled regions as well. The impetus behind building new towns was the belief that these small towns would aid in governing Virginia while pulling as much wealth out of her as possible. The Crown, after so many years, now wanted to control the colony, and in their mind, the best way to control Virginia was doing so the same way that the English had been doing in their Ulster plantations. Virginia wasn't Ulster, however. Tobacco changed that landscape forever. Berkeley had to learn that, and he had to learn it quickly. He had to navigate Virginia's new landscape of middling Stuart immigrants, who came largely from southwestern England. These newly incoming Virginians represented a wide swath. They were laborers, leaders, craftsmen, farmers, and slaves. In Virginia, they advanced to rule in ways unimaginable had they remained in the Old World. But Berkeley represented that Old World, and now he was in the New. How was he to act? By 1642, the plan to create garrison towns was essentially a foregone conclusion. Plantations had been spreading along the major waterways for decades. As more people came into the colony and land grants were patented, Berkeley started to find a new toehold into Virginia power: land. He was the king's agent to bestow those land grants, so he held much sway from the beginning of his tenure. That being the case, his office was the tool that Berkeley needed to force Virginia's elite under his thumb. He used this new situation to act in a manner benefiting both himself and those seeking land. Stemming from land concerns, Berkeley's issues extended beyond problems with his countrymen. He also had to deal with brewing strife among the Powhatan tribes. Their wily leader, the 90-year-old Opechancanough, unable to open his eyes without help, kept a smoldering hatred alive well into his old age. Though he was frail, his mind was still as sharp and vindictive as it was in 1622. Opechancanough had a more difficult time bringing his hatred to fruition in the 1640s, however. The figurative and literal divide between these two peoples was wider than it ever had been. The English had gone to great lengths to ensure that 1622 wouldn't happen again. Former governors, for instance, required outlying settlements to fortify against a potential attack, a policy that Berkeley continued. Also, as a historical reminder, the General Assembly set aside March 22nd as a day of remembrance in which all colonists were to attend church, pray, and learn from the infamous 1622 massacre. Sadly, in a few years' time, Berkeley and the other newly arriving Virginians realized that they hadn't done enough to curtail a new attack. The tenuous but peaceful situation following the 1632 Accords lulled the English into a false sense of security that men like Berkeley never forgot when dealing with the Indians. He couldn't really forget, because the Indian issue was one of the major questions dominating 17th century Virginia. As we shall see, it was ultimately the issue that undid Berkeley some 3 decades later. For now, Berkeley had to deftly balance Indian policy against new land grants, while pleasing tenured Virginians and satisfying unstable English authorities alike. To strike that balance, Berkeley used his governing council.
Into something to uphold, a book untold. So won't you unfold these pages now? Oh, 'cause they're crying and they're crawling
The council was an ill-defined governing body when Berkeley arrived. Was it above or below the governor? Council members thought that they were above, in the case of former Governor Harvey. But contemporary members such as Richard Kemp, Samuel Matthews, and William Claiborne never got along, thus hindering full realization of their authority. When Berkeley arrived, he found no legal provision for the council's power as they saw it, but decided to keep the body intact anyway, while skillfully swaying the members under his influence. Berkeley then used other potential divisions to his advantage in the General Assembly and smaller local governments throughout the colony. Rather than officiously force his power upon the colonists, Berkeley chose to grant as much autonomous control to the settlers as he deemed possible. By that I mean, he didn't undo the evolving legal and governmental framework that started in 1619. He validated that work instead by keeping it in place, and working with the domestic colonial leaders already in office at his arrival. And he chose to work with those leaders through the channels that they had established. It was a genius stroke that calmed everyone's fears that this governor wouldn't undo their work. It also solidified his authority in the process in that contemporary leaders chose to support rather than undermine Governor Berkeley. With new positions opening across newly settled Virginia regions came fresh opportunities. Thus, for the present time, Berkeley's position was one of considerable power and influence in that he controlled land grants, established new positions of authority, and created new gubernatorial opportunities for himself that no governor in the past could imagine. Berkeley had something that others hadn't. He had panache. William had learned from his time at King Charles' court. He learned how not to properly pacify his people. That is, Berkeley understood what it was like to be overlooked and slighted. He chose not to govern in the same way that eventually cost Charles his head. Berkeley chose to govern how he would like to be governed. And Virginia proved to be the land open enough for him to freely put his and his fellow colonists' curious minds to the test. Almost for that alone, Berkeley's original tenure was destined to be great, and the work that he put in soon after his 1642 arrival ensured his success. So, Berkeley managed to leave England unscathed, cross the Atlantic safely, and settled in Virginia quite well. But his first real tests soon came. And those tests would reveal whether this new governor had what it took to manage the royal colony.
I was meant to find it's on the other side of this hill, calling out my name to the light, yeah, to the light.
Thank you again for supporting the podcast. I greatly appreciate it. Please continue to spread the word and help this colony to keep growing. Start by following us on your favorite podcast provider, like us on Facebook, and visit the website. Sharing episodes and other work is the best way to expand the community. Another way to greatly aid the podcast is by providing feedback on iTunes. If you have yet to do so, please take a few minutes and leave us a comment. Doing so helps bring exposure in the iTunes network. If you would like to do more to help out, please consider supporting the podcast on Patreon. Links can be found on the website, or one can visit the campaign at patreon.com/VAHISPod to see the choices and rewards being offered for your support. Also on the website is a one-time support button for those who would like to donate to the work being done. It is located on the website's support page. Please, join me next time as we continue witnessing Virginia's growth under Governor Berkeley.
But do do but des be do do